Start. Okay. Hi everyone. So obviously I'm going to introduce today what we're doing today. As well as that, I'm going to talk a little bit about Sheffield, and hopefully from my talk, I'm not going to use slides, I'm just going to do it all verbally, a few notes. But hopefully from my talk, what you get is kind of a broad outline of the things that kind of impact the city from a slightly wider scale, things like how the city positioning works, kind of the kinds of things and some of the historical roots behind, I guess, why some things are the way they are in Sheffield, and also yeah, essentially a little bit of context, really, just to give a bit of a broad outline. We've got experts who are kind of going to talk about this in a lot more detail. So, like, for example, Simon Ogden was the head of city centre regeneration for a long time. He's going to give us a bit of a tour around the Castlegate site, which is an amazing kind of historical site, which is also in hotly disputed its kind of use, and it's and then we've got Tom, who's given us a current presentation in more detail on that, which is talking in particular about the intersection between that and the Commons. So it's really great to have Tom here today, because he's going to yeah, share a bit about that and some other fantastic speakers throughout the day. But right now, I guess I'll launch into, well, I'll share a bit about our programme, what we're doing today. So I'm doing this talk now. See, that is not the experimental chair again, is it? See, like the other chairs are the ones that we've got worried about. Okay. So the yeah, essentially wanted to do a day like yesterday. We're looking particularly at the Commons, but today looking at Sheffield in focus a bit more, and the relationship with this theme to Sheffield, so we get a bit of a broad idea around the Commons. There's a lot of great experts in Sheffield that can talk a lot about that, some of whom we unfortunately couldn't make it to some of the talks, but hopefully in the future we'll bring a few of them, like Robin from 3 Acres and a Cow and some other guys want to chip in as well. But the idea is that hopefully we'll kind of build an understanding of Commons in relation to Sheffield and some of the major themes of Sheffield throughout this day. So the discussion will focus on Sheffield as a place. So any questions and stuff like that you want to ask, or like hopefully throughout the day there'll be people that you'll be able to ask, throw them at them, and like we'll try and build a dialogue and discussion on that. As well, they'll be interspersed with our normal stuff, like have a discussion point just before lunch, we'll have a discussion and hopefully a walk around town where we identify some abandoned and derelict buildings, and if any of them are open, we might actually take them on as common property, which is why we're going to have to get you to all sign a disclaimer that you're that isn't us. That's your own choice. If you decide to do that, that's fully your own choice. But you know, I might do that. Don't know about you guys, but so yeah, there's a little bit of that which might happen. We'll see. So let's launch into Sheffield and kind of talk a bit about that. So it's probably going to be about 20 minutes. So just to situate where we are, like obviously we're in the north of England, but what does that actually mean? Like, what does being in the north of England mean in the context of global history? The ground kind of beneath us is where, I guess, first of all, England, a lot of history evolved from, you know, the ideas of feudalism, kind of the ideas of land proprietarianism and things like that. Neoliberalism saw its first emergence in England. So a lot of these kinds of, I guess, exported ideologies came from England. And the theorists within England, people like Adam Smith, who spoke about the division of labour in pin manufacturing. We've got people like and working in LSE that kind of coined and kind of formulated the ideas behind neoliberalism. We've got people at London School of Economics. So you know, we've got kind of like ideas that are prevalent in kind of feudalism and early feudalism in the UK that has kind of essentially been were exported during colonialism and kind of ignited certain factors, things like the slave trade and kind of proprietarian relationships. So there's a lot of kind of like looking at deeply into the soul of like English culture, there is a lot to be accountable for. There's a lot to understand, that kind of there's a lot that England needs to kind of better itself. Obviously, many of the people in the kind of movement we're part of, you know, don't really share the ideologies that were maybe promoted, and there's always been a hot discussion. For example, like people like Karl Marx came for refuge in the UK because of its liberal kind of embrace of different kind of cultures. A lot of anarchist theorists come from the UK and or have sought refuge within the UK. So it's not just kind of like, you know, far right discourse that's taken, you know, always been promoted and kind of brought into the world from the UK. There's also a lot of left-wing discourse and things like that that have been engaged with that. So I just wanted to situate us in England and like what that means in terms of like global history, colonialism, kind of all of these cultures, and it's really important that we acknowledge that. But in terms of, in relation to that, what does the north of England mean? What does kind of being in an industrial city mean? And what does kind of like being in, particularly in a very early industrial city? So the north of England, and Sheffield in particular, is where the Industrial Revolution really started. So a lot of the things around kind of like, you know, a lot of the enormous explosive growth that we saw over the last 300 years really emerged from these areas, these points, Manchester, Sheffield, these like significant towns, which were the kind of industrial engines of that early period of growth that we saw. Obviously, like kind of globalization has changed the dynamics of kind of global labor, but we still see a kind of, we still have a backstory and rooted in some of the ideas here. And hopefully there's some really interesting kind of anomalies, or, you know, there's always a narrative around how industry worked and functioned, or a kind of an idealized narrative, but, you know, hopefully we'll find some anomalies, we'll find some kind of like, we'll see the reality of struggles that happened within that industry. We'll kind of start to unpick some of the bones that these kind of industrial histories like being exported to the rest of the world as like a kind of packaged, fully formed thing. This is the way it is. This is what it was, you know, X, Y, Z. So the birthplace, so Sheffield, you know, is known, famous for being the birthplace of steel, you know, the birthplace of the steel industry. Steel, stainless steel was invented here, and we've got kind of this, they could create this, well, essentially the crucible furnace was the kind of like tipping point in the kind of industrial revolution, where somebody kind of, we still don't know who and how and when, like exactly, but we know it came from here because everyone seemed to know it around here, how to like make steel, you know, really well, and they did it like so incredibly fast as well, that kind of, you know, iron and kind of like these other industries that were prevalent before the steel industry kind of couldn't keep up. Steel was just superior to all of those. It allowed, you know, all sorts of things to happen. You know, modernism, result of steel, you know, steel and glass, you know, you can kind of pull steel any direction, you can put glass anyway. So the kind of the early kind of hits, you know, I guess something to account for there. There's also industrial relations that emerge from the steel industry, like massive industrial relations such as the trains and the kind of train tracks and kind of like the bridges, the enormous kind of like I guess infrastructural trends that define the way labour, transit and kind of culture then emerged over the subsequent years, you know. So it's important to situate us in that, although there are many factories and things like that that are in decline, you know, and there's empty buildings, empty spaces and things like that. At one point, Sheffield was, you know, I guess the epicenter of this kind of particular form of innovation. And that's really what defined the entire, you know, the entire modern history of Sheffield. Before it was, you know, before it was a city, it grew alongside its history in a sense. So the city in that relationship, as more people got involved with the steel industry, more people kind of came here, more people, there became things like steel barons, there became things like kind of a lot of steel workers, industrial workers and kind of makers and craftsmen of all kind of varieties working on different things, looking at producing steel and exporting it primarily, not selling it in Sheffield, So importantly, it was an exporting, you know, it didn't really have many imports. It just kind of like, what things, this kind of defined the city grey, which we know for the east and west, you know, the wind would blow, the fumes to the east. So the poor people would live in the east, and the west was kind of cleaner, and it's like, you know, got more trees. And that's basically the same to this day. Like, even though the kind of industry has left the city, we still feel that kind of like, you know, that embedded kind of like reality that like in one area of the city, houses are smaller, no trees kind of, and in another area of the city, houses are kind of slightly larger, steel barons and things like that would live in those places, and you know, there's like a lot of nature, and they really prioritize all of these things. We also see the kind of like emergent different demographics that have layered on top of that kind of that relationship of the, I guess, the essential city fabric over kind of say the, you know, 200 years. If there were kind of immigrant populations, for example, they'll normally be kind of start living in the east of the city, you know, and the west of the city would prioritize this. So that kind of like, although it's not directly related to the industry that's here, the kind of reality of those kinds of spaces, the fabric of the city is continuously defined what it means to be in Sheffield today. So if you trace back, you can go, well, one of the causes of this is the industry that was here. So you can see this kind of like with all of these maps, like how deprivation works, and kind of how things like, you know, things like food insecurity, it's a particular interest of mine, like how food insecurity works and how we kind of like try to actively mitigate that, and how we kind of build social systems and structures that overcome some of the issues that are related to the spatial causes, you know, spatial and industrial causes. So another thing to note is that during the evolution of the industrial kind of, you know, the industrial revolution, there were these tram lines, like kind of were a big significant thing in Sheffield. So tram lines like evolved at the same time as the city was evolving. So what that meant was that you have this kind of bead-like structure of smaller kind of like village, like, you know, villages around the former tram line areas. You know, so like there will be a tram stop there, and then there'll be like, you know, it would feel like a neighborhood around the tram stop, do you know? And there would be trams coming from all different parts of the city. Those trams are now removed, but what we see are like highly developed areas just around a spot of like, you know, a spot of land where a tram stop would be. And it's kind of this invisible infrastructure that, because it evolved at exactly the same time, which is kind of slightly different from, you know, other cities, like often the infrastructure came a bit later, or, you know, it meant that like Sheffield has what you call a kind of, the center of the city of Sheffield isn't as concentrated or the priority as many other cities. So you have these things like you go to like Never Edge, or you go to, you know, you go to different areas of city, and you'll find that there are they're essentially like small villages. They feel like small villages. They have all of their own amenities, and people don't really leave them to come into the city centre because they've evolved in that way that it's not concentrated all in a city centre, you know, because there was always this infrastructure of tram underlying their ability to move in and out. So as I mentioned, it kind of like gives the city a kind of, I guess what you call this like neighborhood or community feeling, especially on the outskirts. So people go, oh yeah, like, you know, it feels like a small neighborhood. It feels like we're in a small village, or it feels like that because people are generally kind of like in these areas. They have all the amenities they live. Actually, there's a lot of people living very happily in Sheffield, even in areas that people tend to have, you know, quite a good life in Sheffield. So that's something that's important to know, you know, because can focus on the kind of like ideas of deprivation and things like that, but there are like a lot of people who really are passionate about Sheffield, and like, you know, there's an enormous amount of merit in how Sheffield operates and functions as a city. Like although the city centre is run, you know, many parts of it are run down, there are still these kind of like nodes around the city centre that are kind of like function as the amenities that people need. So as I say, it's like, also the culture of it being an export economy means that it's not necessarily an industrial city. Means that it's not necessarily like a shopping city like London. You don't go into a city centre and there's like loads of fancy shops everywhere, or like, you know, you go into kind of Brussels and you go around and you go, there's like a nice suit shop or whatever. People weren't really buying suits in Sheffield, and people kind of like have always been creating, making things in Sheffield and then exporting them and going to buy their fancy suits when they go for a meeting in London. Do you know, that's kind of like how it, and there's even like roads that have evolved, like they've got roads called London Road, for example. So like London Road is like literally because that was the direction to London and we export everything to London. So London Road is a significant road, you know, and then there's loads of shops along London Road. It's like, why are there loads of shops along London Road? It's like, oh, because everyone was moving through London Road just to go to London. That was like the big thing. Everyone would make things here and move down to London and sell them all in London and come back and live a nice life up in Sheffield, you know? So this kind of like, I guess it's interesting in relation to the way the industry, where the community evolved around industry. So there's this idea that shared work makes a group, and the way the kind of work we do develops and evolves our kind of group structures and our, like the way we interact with each other. So like in Sheffield, we started to develop this kind of city of, you know, there's this big thing called the City of Makers, where there's lots of different people making lots of different things, lots of different experts over time, lots of people coming here for the steel industry. And it kind of grew to a high enough concentration that traditionally there's this narrative that all industrial culture is around the division of labour of pin manufacturing. So the division of labour is, if anyone's not familiar with it, it's a kind of a formulaic understanding that if you divide your labour between various people and people just do one thing, then it means that the net benefit is exponentially more than kind of the, and that's been heavily criticised because it removes things like craftsmanship from the things like that. But, you know, and which it does do as well, and it creates alienation, which it does do well. But there's no denying that it also makes things quicker. You know, so like the division labour was like massively rolled out. But in Sheffield, what's an interesting thing is like there's also a counter narrative to how the division of labour actually work. We have this idea of the little masters, which is like these kind of like small kind of little masters or masters of themselves is what it means. And the idea is that all of these people were kind of, the city was like, had so many specialists, loads of little specialists, that at one point a person could go from the, you know, they're building a skyscraper in New York, or they're building a kind of a train track in, you know, they're building a train track in Paris, you know, and they come and they say to one person in Sheffield, oh, we're building this train track in Sheffield. And that any person within the city could organise the labour force collectively to just kind of create a division of labour almost out of scratch, because there were so many people that were specialists here that you could say to one person that goes, oh, Gary, okay, Fred, George and Paul need to do that in order to make that thing happen. Do you know? And they would all be little masters, their own little entrepreneurs, and then they would kind of like work individually, but then they would also come together collectively whenever there was an order, whenever there was something that would happen, which is a really interesting kind of difference of idea of what the division of labour really means. From traditionally, it's like you have this factory kind of one owner model, but the division of labour in Sheffield really meant the kind of like distributed or dispersed division of labour, which is a fascinating kind of like concept, and started to develop this kind of idea of I guess it kind of meant that there was a high degree of speed in terms of like unique or bespoke orders that could be fulfilled within Sheffield, because people just continuously reorganize their labour force like really quickly, and then, you know, like because of their connection with each other. But it also meant that labour and kind of labour relations were heavily what you call integrated. So within traditional kind of organizational structures, you might have hub and spoke models where everything goes to like a center, or everything goes to a single thing, you know. Whereas in Sheffield, it was very integrated, so everyone knew everyone, and that was what allowed it to function, which meant that often, it didn't always like it could do a lot of things very well, but it wasn't going to create new things because, you know, it wasn't going to do much more than it was doing because it was already doing so much. Do you see what I mean? So there was like, and then also like troubles which emerged from that kind of trust. So you walk into steel industries and things like that, you walk around the corner and you can literally walk into a knife maker's steel and like see everything, and it was all open and quite transparent, and everything was kind of trusting and everything like that. But it also meant that kind of when globalization started to come through, people who actually had an incentive to kind of take some of those ideas and things like that could really easily kind of come in and go, actually, we're going to kind of do that over an hour, you know, like, you know, we're going to do that somewhere else, which is exactly kind of some of the big you know, I guess the history of globalization is where kind of, I guess, something important to talk about next, and the relationship with Sheffield and the, let me just run through this. So the war was a significant, you know, up until the 1930s, 1940s, Sheffield was running, managing, and kind of like almost a completely different city to the one we see today in many ways. I mean, not entirely, there's still the fabric, it's a fabric thing, but many of the steel, because it was targeted during the war, like by, you know, bombs, and kind of, it was completely flattened, like huge kind of factories were flattened, things like that, because obviously if you could immobilize the steel making place, you could stop people from producing planes, and you could stop, you know, kind of like you could make. So there's a big kind of thing about large parts of the city and what we see in the city centre and things like that. We can look at historic maps and see that there's an enormous amount of, I guess, like different kinds of factories, different kinds of facilities. People will be working above their shops, you know, and kind of relating to things in different ways. But essentially a lot of that cultural fabric was flattened during the war. It wasn't just architectural fabric, it's also cultural fabric. After that, I guess there's this kind of like idea of kind of, you know, in the 70s and 80s, the post-war period, we saw this kind of, well, just post-war, we saw this enormous influx of what we called it was called the numbers game, the housing, creation of public housing, that was essentially politicians kind of racing against each other in the UK to try and build just as many houses as they could to look like they were trumping other politicians. So like after the war, they were like, we're going to build 10 million houses. And then I was like, we're going to build 11 million houses. And that numbers game is what kind of led to our enormous rollout of concrete kind of brutalist housing, you know, and kind of like the quickest housing that we could build, because politicians wanted to show they were making progress rebuilding things after the war, and they wanted to be the ones that were in power, you know, and that was the thing people cared about. Everyone was like, everything's wrecked, can we just like have some, you know, houses, like, and everyone was like, yes, the houses are all, you know, which is, we should like, but it meant that there's like, it meant that we have this kind of like this, a lot of housing in the UK, and a lot of housing emerged from that culture. I mean, I'm not going to touch on Park Hill too much, because there's a slightly, like, the narrative of Park Hill is really interesting in the sense that it was a kind of slum clearance, and slum dwellers were given a new kind of like an estate to live on, which, you know, largely concrete kind of estate that kind of mimicked the neighborhood that they were living in. So the neighbors would live next to the neighbors they were living in on their streets. But it also meant that, you know, like these typologies, of course, we all know, like as architects, that they don't do certain things, you know, they don't do certain things like, can't just expand them out, you know, we can't just change them how we want. We have to live within this rigid conformity of like the structures that are given to us by the central state. And you know, so, but anyway, the idea of post-war housing, and I guess kind of in the 80s, like they're bringing us to the 80s, is like really, we start to talk about globalization, Thatcher era, and Thatcher and Reagan era was kind of like really globalization became a big thing on the agenda, and a lot of the mining industries, a lot of the remaining steel industries and things like that were completely savaged by this kind of like Thatcherite globalization agenda, which essentially, like, the proposals were to take all of the industry out from the north of England and put them in overseas, kind of in China and things like that, which was already kind of happening to a degree, but then it kind of like was completely exacerbated by this kind of thing. And there was an enormous kind of like battering of unions, union busting movements, and the Sheffield kind of like mining community was just like the heart of the union culture and the labour culture. So Sheffield is, because of its, you know, working culture, it was a heavily left-wing city, so it became a kind of heart of that, and also the thing that was most heavily attacked, you know, during that whole campaign. So everything about Sheffield was like, by the Thatcherite kind of era, was just completely, they were trying to rip it apart. They were trying to, like, you know, union bust. They were trying to kind of like ruin any resistance against the globalization agenda and kind of move things forward. And you saw in the 80s, like things like the 3-day, you know, the kind of weeks where people would go on strike. There were enormous kind of inflationary pressures, and all of these things are happening. And Sheffield was really kind of at the heart of that movement. And ultimately, the struggle ended in globalization kind of, you know, being the thing that actually happened. So all of these industrial buildings, everything that was here, and like a lot of that kind of remaining culture from that bustling steel industry we saw with the little messes and things like that from the previous century, was kind of the final nail in the coffin for the kind of that industry. What emerged was, like, obviously we know things like Manchester, Sheffield music culture kind of emerge, and this kind of dynamic that we're going from what is an industrial city to a cultural city, because we've got all of these excess space, we've got all these empty buildings, we've got all of these things. And we see things like, from Manchester particularly, you see things like Joy Division, you see a hacienda emerging, house music, like all of these like enormous cultures kind of born out of that resistance against kind of like these globalized and localized kind of pressures on people, and their struggle to find new identity after this kind of cultural dismantling. And like we kind of start to move towards a world where we're like talking or thinking of, I guess, like people are talking about the truth of things, you know, we see like, and people are trying to express their truth or trying to get it out. And but also the kind of what Fran was talking about yesterday is like factory spaces giving this level of flexibility. So the hacienda is a really interesting example. Like it emerged from, it's not from Sheffield, I'm talking about Manchester, but I'm going to bring it to Sheffield in a sec. Like the hacienda is an interesting example of where like musical culture and factory culture kind of were facilitated with one another, because it was where the first Sex Pistols gig was, you know, it was also kind of where Joy Division, all of these bands came from, Smiths, things like that. They went through the hacienda, and then it turned into the birthplace of house music and kind of club culture. The first DJs started playing there, stuff like that, especially the kind of DJs we know, kind of Bronx DJs, like kind of people that play techno and stuff. But that culture is related to situationist ideas. So the hacienda is from the word is brought from a book called The Formularies for a New Urbanism by Ivan Pritchlov, who talks about the idea of the hacienda is this place. It's kind of like a weirdly, like, I don't think it's very good piece of writing, like, which is weird that it's like the inspiration for like the hacienda, which is much more, but it's interesting because it's a situation, essentially it comes from the 1968 kind of protests and things like that, which were happening on the other side of the world, well, in France, and you know, but there were people like Malcolm McLaren, these amazing cultural figures that were knocking around, kind of, that were, you know, bringing, Malcolm McLaren brought a lot of the situationist ideas back to the UK, and like these kinds of individuals were really prominent in propagating that sort of thing. And the form was that the idea, of course, is that situations could be reinvented continually, and that chimed with what people needed in the north of England, you know, because people were in a place where it needed to be reinvented. So you're like, right, we need to make something, we need to have some kind of inspiration, some cultural underpinning behind it. So those kinds of theories actually led on to like a lot of the music culture that is famous within the North of England. But we also like see things like the Arctic Monkeys coming from Sheffield, you know, people like all of these great bands, Human League from Sheffield, you know, so, and electronic music, there's a lot of techno electronic music that still comes from the warehouses, the kind of places, it's still being invented today. There's like incredible, you know, I think the strongest industry in Sheffield is probably its electronic music, in my opinion. Like it's one of the most interesting things, is electronic music comes out of Sheffield. Loads of people just like literally tucked away, have got all the time in the world to just make this insane good, like, and really well developed stuff. A lot of stuff emerging now, like Alga Rave and stuff like that. So there's a bit of a cultural kind of discourse with the architectural discourse, and like the reality is that our fabric of the space, our cultural spaces, they're just, you know, one and the same, and they kind of relate to each other. So what is the economy today? As I said, like industrial decline, and the kind of like the fabric of the city is in a difficult place, you know, and we need that. There's dialogue that needs to be made with Sheffield, the idea of commons, but there's also, like, I guess people, there are more experts on the commons. As I say, there's a lot of resistance movements and things like that. So Sheffielders tend to be very the outdoors. What I haven't spoken about very much is the outdoors. You know, the nature around Sheffield is beautiful. So it's like the peaks and things like that. So people tend to be very protective of like that, and like also kind of are quite left wing. So they try and, you know, create a culture where there's a kind of mutual shareholding and stuff like that of that, and like a commons. So the kind of rivers and you know, the trees and the kind of like hills and the kind of Yorkshire tea kind of like image of like the, you know, you walk out to the, you know, there are like just cows looking around and stuff, which is lovely. And so that is in a bit, it is in a bit of contrast with the kind of like the dense kind of industrial struggle that's being felt here. But that's kind of seems to be where people are kind of bringing their mind to, like within Sheffield, is like actually the place, what maybe we should focus on is stuff around nature, the outdoors, and the great outdoor city is kind of a big push today. So, but then I guess the question for architects and us is like, okay, so that's all, how do we slot into that kind of context? You know, like how do we engage with that? How do we create relations within Sheffield and kind of build continuously to, and like try and build projects and things like that where we can support but also just to kind of contribute and, like, you know, build kind of discussions and dialogues with people that are, you know, doing amazing stuff already. So it's a kind of continuous process, and, like, you know, I think that that's kind of me giving my personal summary of Sheffield and from what I've learned from my time here. So I've been here for like almost 8 years, so that's kind of my understanding of how the lay of the land is. But then there's a lot of different perspectives, and I think over this day we'll get some different perspectives and divergent kind of themes will emerge. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe we don't need to do any comments or questions. We can just talk about, I don't know, we can maybe go get warm a bit.
Should we go get warm?
Yeah.
Well, what we also said we would do is we're going to have this like shared Google Map.
Okay.
We could start to like put stuff on the notes, so maybe we could cut out.
Yeah. Are there any comments from you? I think these from Sheffield. So like I've been here for only a third of my life. But you.
Well, I guess I kind of, my kind of teenage experience of being a Sheffielder was like trying to kind of find myself and my cultural identity in a city that was also trying to find itself, its cultural identity around music. So there was a lot of like trawling around kind of like vintage shops and just like recording studios and kind of like cool places to hang out. And it's interesting to see how it's trying to kind of like build itself around that now that I've kind of slightly moved away from that. In terms of the outdoor city stuff, I think what is interesting that the narrative around the outdoor city is often kind of controlled by like 20 to 30-year-old men who enjoy rock climbing and have got very active bodies and kind of like throw themselves around the city. So like just on this side that's on, which I'm disorientated this way, this empty side, there's a lot of talk about how this can be a kind of representation of the outdoor city. And what's quite interesting about that is the manifestation of that becomes like, oh, we're going to build the biggest rock climbing wall in Europe. Representation of like young fit bodies performing in the city. So I think an interesting question is how that outdoor city can be something which a lot of people can kind of attach to, and in the same way that, you know, myself as a white middle-class teenager was finding myself in the city of kind of underground culture and music. How might that work for, you know, people living in the city of Sanctuary on the eastern side of the city that way, who are trying to equally kind of find themselves in the city? How might the outdoor city work for them? Yeah, but I think it was a great. I mean, even I learned stuff having I think lived here all my life. So thank you very much for that.
Any more comments or thoughts, or should we do Joe's suggestion? Yeah, should we go and warm up? Let's go to the front room.
Yeah.
And we're good.
Cool.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks.